Hey guys, welcome back. In this week's video, we're going to look at ships in the Halo universe. They're a staple of the franchise. They make frequent appearances both in the books as well as the games, and they serve as a legendary backdrop to warfare between humanity and the Covenant. But how do they compare to the ships that we have today? The UNSC primarily refers to their ships in a few different classes. You have things like frigates, and then heavier, you have cruisers, and even carriers such as the Infinity. But each of these is so much larger than anything that we're capable of producing in the current era that for the sake of today's video, I'll primarily focus on frigates. The UNSC classify the frigates as both heavy and light. Each frigate does have a MAC gun, their primary offensive weapon. Just past that, some of the loadouts change a little bit. The Paris class, for instance, carries a significantly heavier nuclear missile loadout. They have 3 Shiva nuclear silos, and that's going to be your heavy-hitting, presumably multi-warhead nuclear missiles, in addition to 12 Harpoon nuclear missiles, which are going to be a little bit lighter. Each ship, though, does carry archer pods, which are kind of your general-purpose space-to-space and space-to-surface missiles with a primarily high-explosive warhead. Paris classes, for instance, carry 26. The Stalwart's only 16, but then the Charon class bumps that back up to 50. For close-in defense, each frigate has Rampart twin-barreled 50mm guns. The number kind of varies a little bit depending on the class, but that is their primary point defense system. These twin-barreled guns are very effective against mid-sized targets, things like Seraphs or even Phantoms, but I believe it may struggle a little bit against something like a Banshee, and that's primarily because 50mm is kind of a heavier caliber, and being twin-barreled, it's going to have a lower rate of fire. The Stalwart class is actually listed as having 52 Bulwark point defense systems, and that sounds more reasonable to me for something like a 20 to 30mm Gatling gun. Very high rate of fire meant to defend against any sort of close-in missile or craft. When it comes to the size of frigates in the UNSC, they're all roughly 15 to 1700 feet long, 5 to 650 feet wide, and 4 to 500 feet tall. This may not sound like much, but that's actually significantly larger than anything produced today. But despite that size, they're only crewed by roughly 250 officers and enlisted for sailors. When it comes to defenses, UNSC frigates primarily rely on their titanium armor meant to take a good punch. It's not discussed much, but presumably they use things like chaff and decoys to defeat any sort of guided threat, as well as like something like jamming to interrupt communications between enemy vessels. When it comes to guiding in their own missiles and guns, we can see looking at images of them they have what appears to be a fire control radar on top, and then presumably they have things like passive acquisition, like infrared search and track looking for heat signatures, visual sensors like telescopes, in addition to things like long-range search and acquisition radars. So that's how the UNSC does it, but what does it look like in the modern world? Well, it's interesting because frigates have relatively fallen out of use in modern navies, and that's because they primarily were used in World War II and a little bit after for their lightweight, low-cost design. Frigates were meant to protect shipping lanes and lines of communication. Think back to the Atlantic in World War II when the United States was sending shipping material over to the UK. You don't want to commit something like a destroyer to have to defend soft targets, but you know that they're going to be hunted by submarines. So instead they start to rely heavily on frigates, which are a little bit slower and less powerful, but they're really there just for deterrence. They could protect shipping from any sort of submarine activity while freeing up heavier ships to play a role in the fleet-on-fleet, ship-on-ship combat. The closest thing we have today, at least in the US, would be the literal line of combat ships, but frankly, they're not very good and they're being decommissioned for that reason. Other navies still do use frigates, such as China, and that's because, like I said, they're cheap, small, but they're still capable of short-range air defense or ship-on-ship combat. China has a huge amount of coastline and a lot of seas that they're trying to protect, so for them it makes sense to have these lightweight ships there for kind of close-in defense. Compare that to the United States, which is more of an expeditionary force, projecting naval power across the globe. They're not interested in having light, small ships when they can instead have a heavier-hitting guided missile destroyer. When it comes to defenses in the modern world, in terms of taking a hit, US ships in particular use Kevlar around their critical areas. These plates are meant to splinter and distribute energy should they be hit by gunfire or missile. But for the most part, the US prefers to not get hit to begin with. And that's why you see technologies such as decoys and chaff to steer missiles away, and then close-in weapon systems like the phalanx, or even lasers, which are incredibly high rates of fire, or in the case of a laser, a lot of directed energy that defeat missiles before they can hit the ship. So how do the two compare? Well, like I said, frigates don't really have much of a role in the modern world anymore. But frigates in the UNSC sense actually fill a role I would say is closer to the guided missile destroyer in modern navies. And that's because the UNSC uses frigates as like a defensive backbone. They have some offensive capability with the MAC gun and nuclear missiles, but really they're there because they're maneuverable and they're smaller. They can help protect the heavier capital ships the UNSC has from being attacked. If you look at Halo 2 when they're defending the stations, frigates used by the UNSC were capable of like kind of defeating larger ships, or at least preventing them from getting as close. So I said they're similar to Arleigh Burke kind of guided missile destroyers, but how do they really shape up? Well, Arleigh Burkes are roughly 500 feet long, 50 feet wide. Now compare that to, like I said, a UNSC frigate, which is 15 to 1700 feet long. It's almost 3 times as big. Despite that, guided missile destroyers in the US Navy have a crew size closer to 700 enlisted officers, which is roughly 3 times the size that you see in the UNSC. The difference there presumably is because the UNSC is so advanced in the future, they probably have incredible automation on their ships. That's not even factoring things like artificial intelligence will probably reduce the crew load significantly. Both, though, in my opinion, serve very similar roles when it comes to the fleet. Arleigh Burkes, don't carry nukes, and that's mainly for political reasons. Countries prefer not to have nuclear-armed ships, sailing freely about their borders. It's easier to hide a submarine than it is a destroyer. But they do carry a ton of missiles. Arleigh Burkes carry 96 vertically launched missiles in cells, and that's their primary offensive and defensive tool. Arleigh Burkes are known for their radar and electronic warfare capability. They can track a lot of threats at once, and they have the standard missile family of missiles that the US Navy primarily uses. And those missiles can be used in air-to-air modes. They're anti-ship, and they can be even used for things like ballistic missiles, while still having the option to carry something like a cruise missile for surface attack. When it comes to guns, they're relatively underpowered compared to the UNSC counterparts. They only have maybe 1 or 2 25mm deck guns. That's primarily meant to destroy like small close-in ships. When it comes to point defense systems, because of their smaller size, they really only have 1, maybe 2 20mm close-in weapon system phalanx guns. And like I said, that's because the US primarily relies on things like chaff and decoys to kind of steer away and defeat any sort of guided missile threat. But it wouldn't obviously do them much good against something like plasma. So Arleigh Burkes carry more missiles than UNSC frigates, but the one thing they don't have is the MAC gun. The MAC gun contains insane kinetic energy, and it's a primary offensive weapon. The only downside being that you have to turn to your target and hit them head on, or some other variation of leading your shot. MAC guns unfortunately are not guided, which is their main drawback, and primarily why I'd say we see the UNSC engaging in combat so close to the Covenant, because you have to be close in order to not miss. Despite the differences though, they do have a lot of similarities, and I do feel like UNSC frigates serve a very similar role to guided missile destroyers. And really, when it comes to ships in the UNSC compared to the real world, I think in the real world we see a lot more emphasis on things like missiles and a lot less on guns. And some of that can be chalked up to sci-fi, and some of that can be chalked up that we don't have anything as powerful as a MAC gun in the real world. The UNSC ships are significantly larger, with less crew. And that's, like I said, automation and artificial intelligence make a huge difference there in capability. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe. I really enjoy making the content for you guys, and I'm always looking for ideas. If you have any feedback for me as well, I'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments below.